Alright everyone, I thought I'd do a book review today because I keep promising to do book reviews on this channel and I never get around to it, so let's get started. This is a book written by a serial killer. It's The Gates of Janus by Brady, the Moor's murderer. And I think originally this was meant to be an anonymous book, like it was supposed to be published as a book that was written by a serial killer, but you weren't supposed to know. And as he was writing it, he sort of was writing it under the assumption that it would be anonymous, because he didn't want his notoriety to affect the reader's sort of interpretation of what he was saying. But I don't know. Once it was out of his hands, they were like, "No, we're going to publish it with your name." It was pretty much the only way they could do it and sell the book, really. I think, because and they got his face plastered on the front there. But apparently he was really unhappy about the final product because they've put in like some introductions and some afterwords that he really didn't like, but he had no say in the matter. So I thought I would do a review of this, just give you an opinion on what I thought. So the book starts off with a really long introduction by Colin Wilson, and what I hate about books is really long introductions by the person who's not the author. I can't stand them, and it's almost like a book length in itself, and I'll admit I just skipped right past it. When I buy a book on a certain topic, especially like it's a book about serial killing written by a serial killer, the last thing I want to do is read a really long introduction. Like that much of it is an introduction. It doesn't seem that long on the picture, but I was like, no, I'm not. I'm just skipping right to the Ian Brady bit. So, yeah, I don't know what the intro says. It might be something really insightful, but I skipped it. So the Ian Brady section, which makes up the big portion of the book, most of it's about his own. He looks at other serial killers' crimes and tries to interpret, like. He just sort of writes about them, really, and then he sort of offers his own sort of analysis of the crimes and their motivations, and in some cases where they're unsolved crimes, or he thinks that someone's been wrongly accused, he tries to solve them. He thinks of himself a bit of a psychologist, a criminal profiler. He sort of sets himself up to be quite a, saying that from his own first-hand knowledge of serial killing, that he can have a good insight into the minds of other serial killers and maybe help the police find them. But what his writings about serial killers, if you're looking for something, like if you're looking for a book about these certain serial killers that he mentions in the book, I don't think you'll find anything new there. He doesn't really offer anything too insightful about these serial killers. It's more reading between the lines with this book, reading what he's written about other serial killers and how that relates to his own crimes. It's about what he doesn't mention in the book than what he does mention. My favourite bit that he wrote was the very beginning chapter of the book, where he doesn't write about other serial killers. It's just basically him describing his own philosophy towards serial killing, and he kind of tries to sort of justify it in a way, but it's just really interesting to sort of get that insight into the way his mind works. And I think his basic sort of idea is that society is so corrupt that his own crimes aren't really any worse than what's done by like governments and army generals and people, like he says, oh well, if governments can go out and bomb countries and kill thousands of people, then how's that any worse than me going out and killing some kids or something? But it doesn't really go into it. There's a kind of gap in his logic. It's like, how does the government, him sort of condemning like the actions of like the government or like big businesses. He talks about how like big businesses ruining people's lives and they don't really care. He's like, how is it any worse than what I've done? It's like, well, it's not really. It doesn't mean you should go out and do it anyway. Like, You know, he's like trying to justify it because other people do bad things, but it's like there's a kind of gap between why someone else doing something justifies him doing it. He never really gets into explaining that. And a lot of it, like when I was reading the final part of the book where other people were talking about Brady, apparently he was having like a lot of mental health problems towards the end of his life. Maybe he was going a bit sort of senile because he was quite old when he wrote this. He was in like a mental health ward, like whether or not he was actually insane or whether he just faked it to get out of prison and go into a mental health ward is a matter of dispute. But you know, like there's some like gaps in what he's saying, and it's kind of like you wish he'd elaborate a bit more on his own philosophy about serial killing, and maybe it's just that there's like a gap in the way his brain works. You just can't see the difference between someone not doing something bad and him doing something bad. Another thing. Sorry, I just had a big bang in my house. What the fuck? Okay. Hope it's not a serial killer. Another thing he talks about in his philosophy section is that people. He sort of has this idea that people don't commit crimes just because they're too afraid of the results of those crimes. What he says is that one is like going to jail or getting caught or being like caught by someone and beaten up, or you know, like something like that. You know, like what am I saying? Like the result of the crime, like, you know, going to prison or getting fined or something, but also like the social, being like socially outcast for committing those crimes, like how other people will view you, and you know, it's like people worry so much about how other people think of them that they don't commit crimes because there's like this social pressure to not commit these crimes. He never ever seems to. It doesn't even seem to have any comprehension that people might not do these things just because they themselves will feel bad about the other person. Like, you wouldn't go up and just punch a random person in the face because you'd feel bad for doing that to the other person. You know, or something along those lines. He doesn't seem to have any idea that people wouldn't do something just because they'd feel bad for the other person, like they'd have some empathy for that person. It's only ever in his head that people are too cowardly to commit these crimes. He talks about how, you know, a serial killer, the reader might be viewing a serial killer as this like degenerate, corrupt person, but in a lot of ways a serial killer is you know, has a lot more sort of courage and a lot more social awareness than a law-abiding citizen. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. He does seem to have this gap in his brain where he can't comprehend people not doing something just because they feel bad about it. You know, he doesn't seem to get that concept. And actually, I was talking about this with a girl I worked with who's doing psychology, like studying psychology at university. And I was saying that, and she was like, "This is something that they learn about, is that in childhood development, there's a point at about like 5 or 6 where you start to understand the concepts. Like you at a certain age, you only think people don't do things because they're worried about getting caught doing those things, rather than just having a sense that what they're doing is wrong in the first place." And that's like a key part in development of childhood psychology, is that you start to develop that sense of empathy towards other people. And you know, it's if people don't get that development, then they'll you know, develop problems in later life. Maybe they'll become like a psychopath or something like that. So that was really interesting. Like you know, he tries to justify the actions. He doesn't like apologise for it or, you know, try to say it's right. He just says, well, it's no worse than other people, and you know, you'd be doing it yourself. I'm sure you fantasise about killing people. Well, I've just done it, and you know, what makes me worse than you, and stuff like that. It's interesting, but yeah, there is a gap in his thought process. Another sense you get from it is that it's almost, even though it's written by Brady as an old man, it's almost like reading something by like a petulant teenager, like an edgy teenager. and you kind of, I don't know, I think it's kind of it's a little bit sort of tragic in a way, because it's almost like you get the sense that it's a, you know, and it is written by a man who was locked up from a quite a young age, and his whole life has been like behind bars basically. You know, I don't know how old he was when he got caught, but he wasn't very old, and it's almost like he hasn't grown out of that phase of his life where he was like a rebellious, I don't know, early, what was he, how old was he when he got caught? But I don't know, whatever age he was, you can tell he was in some kind of like rebellious phase, and maybe he hasn't grown out of that because he hasn't really had any other experience in life. He hasn't had that chance to grow up and take responsibility, and whether things have gone differently for him, whether he would have developed more. But it seems like it's written by someone who's in old age but hasn't really developed from the mindset of like someone in their early 20s or their teenage years, and that could just be a lot to do with this, you know, how his brain works. There's people in the back of the book, there's people like describing like meeting him and stuff, and someone describes it like it reminds them of a friend they had when they were a kid, where the friend would constantly like overreact to anything and act like a complete spoilt brat, and then so you think, oh, I'm not hanging around with that kid anymore. Well, then you'd meet him again and he'd be really nice and he'd be so charismatic, you'd kind of get drawn to him. And it's kind of the sense you get from this book, is that, you know, it's written a lot of ways like by a petulant child almost. What else was I gonna say? Also, he seems to have this thing about the media, like how the, you know, because his whole life he's been like harassed by the media, hasn't he? His crimes have been like proper indulged over by the papers, you know, and he writes about how the newspapers trying to hold this like moral judgment over him and over other criminals, whereas they're just basically wallowing in the depths of these crimes and making money off the crimes themselves, you know. And like any time there's this depraved sex killer, they're basically condemning it in the papers, but they're like rubbing their hands together in glee because you know, they're going to make a load of money from selling papers, writing about these stories and writing about all the disgusting details. And it's all like moral relativism, really. It's he does a lot of quotes of Nietzsche. Is that how you say the name? And other things like loads of like quotes from books that seem to justify his own crimes and stuff. What else? Some parts are actually quite like insightful, and like the things he says about the media. Bear in mind, I think this was written in 2001, and this was before all like the phone tapping scandals and all that stuff came out. But he seems to almost sort of be predicting this stuff happening, and like, you know, just he has this insight into how the media works, which I think a lot of people didn't get that insight until years later when all this stuff came out. And in quite a few parts of the book you think, well, for someone who'd been locked up all these years, he does actually seem to have quite a, you know, he is intelligent, you can tell, and he does have a good insight into certain things. You know, despite this gap in his understanding of human interactions, he does have quite interesting insights into other parts, and in some parts he like jokes, and he comes across as quite likable. You know, it's not like you're reading this whole thing and thinking, God, yeah, this terrible person. You know, whether that's part of his manipulation, his sort of psychopathic manipulative nature, but yeah, at times he comes across as likable, and you know, it's quite well written. It's a bit wordy, like the sentences run on quite a bit, but it's you kind of get the sense that this is just because he's locked up. You know, it's just someone writing and then adding a bit more to a sentence and adding more, and you get the feeling that it's overworked, like he's rewritten bits over and over again, and it's like each sentence is really like intricate. And then the rest of the book is basically him writing about other serial killers, and yeah, you don't really get a lot of insight into these serial killers. It is just more about how you think his brain works and how you look at how he talks about these crimes, which makes the book interesting. What else do I say? Oh, and then the end of the book, which is actually maybe more interesting than the actual content of the book itself. But the afterword, Peter Sotos writes. There's like 2 afterwords by him. There's one quite short one, which just cuts straight to the point. It's just basically, it says you don't get a child pornographer to write about serial killing, because that's the least interesting thing that they could write about. You know, he basically just says like Brady was this child molester, child pornographer. Him thinking he has some kind of insight into serial killers isn't really where his expertise lies. You know, and the fact that he's omitted talking about any child murderers or anything like that in his book, he only focuses on killers of adults, is very sort of telling. And the afterword by Sotos is really fascinating, because the guy is obsessed with Ian Brady. He's like read all the books on him. He's just been studying Ian Brady's crimes for years. He's got like a weird obsession with him, and also he's like sick in the head himself. Like at one point he admits that he gets pictures of Ian Brady's child murder victims, like pictures of their faces, like taken with their families, cuts them out and sticks them over photographs of child porn. So that kind of gives you an idea of what kind of person Peter Sotos is. You know, he kind of writes in his way that, you know, he hasn't really got any moral superiority over someone like Brady. He's basically saying like, I'm pretty much as sick as someone like that, and you know, but he's really sort of cutting. He really gets into the motivations of him, and he talks about Ian Brady's crimes, and then bits like takes excerpts from where Ian Brady's talking about other people's crimes and how that relates to, you know, like trying to like show like there's a bit where Ian Brady talks about someone murdering someone in a bath, and then, you know, sort of he's trying to think about, oh well, you know, killing someone in a bath is very messy, and he probably felt like this. And then Peter sort of says, well, this pretty much relates to this crime that Ian Brady did, where he killed a kid in the bath or something like that. And you know, he kind of links these things, the crimes, with Brady's crimes, and that makes the rest of, like, you want to go back and read the book again after reading the outros, you know, the afterwards, because it really sort of adds this sort of insight to what Brady said in the book. Like I'm quite a big fan of Peter Sotos' writing anyway. Like I find him really interesting, a really interesting writer. So, you know, maybe I'm a bit biased, but I really enjoyed the afterword almost more than the actual book itself, because you want to look at the bits that Ian Brady's wrote, basically, for the most part, it's just a run-of-the-mill serial killer book. It doesn't add a lot. You know, if you didn't know it was written by Brady, it really you wouldn't see that much in it. You know, the beginning chapter, if you left that out, especially, because that is, you know, goes a bit more into his crimes. But yeah, I recommend this if you're interested in psychology, serial killer psychology, serial killers. Ian Brady himself, if you're interested, I say give this book a go, because I found it really interesting. Like I say, it's more interesting from what's not said than what is said. But I would definitely recommend this, Gates of Janus. It's one of them books where you read it and then you just like, I've read that. I've read a book by a serial killer now. You know, it's one of them. It's like an experience, and yeah, it's fascinating. Just being, it's like being sat with Ian Brady and him talking to you about things, and just being like, oh yeah, that's how you think, is it? Well, I see how your brain works. That's very interesting, Ian. So I don't know. Also at the end of the book, Peter Sotos is talking about how Brady said he'd written a more in-depth book about his life and his actual crimes that would reveal some of the locations of the bodies that he'd buried. But I've never heard anything since about that book, and seems like it was meant to be published after Brady's death, but I haven't heard anything about that book coming to light. I don't know if anyone has more knowledge on that, whether they can I don't know, let me know in the comments or something. But there we go. That's not a very good book review, is it? We rambled on a bit too much there, I think. But that's my thoughts. Okay. Let me know if you've read it or if you plan to read it, and see you next time.